Welcome everyone near and far to our third Shine the Light Conference on Human Trafficking. I am Larry Couch, Director of the National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, known as NAC. And we are honored that you've chosen to spend your time with us in pursuit of a more equitable world and one that is free from the horrors of human trafficking. Through our activities at NAC, we serve as a voice representing the Good Shepherd Sisters and their social service agencies at the federal level to empower those on the margins, with a particular attention to women and children. The sisters are known around the world for their efforts to end human trafficking, modern-day slavery, and economic disenfranchisement. They have dedicated themselves to serving girls, women, and families who experience poverty, exploitation, vulnerability, and marginalization. The Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd was founded in France in 1835 and is in 70 countries on 5 continents. The sisters have had a presence in the United States for over 175 years and currently serve in 22 states and 1 US territory. Our first 2 conferences were held in person at the US Capitol. And while we missed the beautiful location, we are excited to be able to bring this conference to more people by virtue of its being virtual. Human trafficking is a growing global criminal industry with power, money, and licentiousness at its center that disregards the truth that every individual has worth and human dignity. In addition, it is the structures, policies, and attitudes of our societies that enable the trafficking of persons for sex and labor. The speakers at our conference will address some of the root causes of human trafficking, with special emphasis surrounding the issue of migration and the disparities due to race. Human trafficking is a nonpartisan concern where bipartisan solutions are possible. We are honored to have 4 outstanding members of Congress serving as our honorary co-chairs this year. New to us this year is Congressman James Mcgovern of Massachusetts. We welcome back Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Also, we are pleased to welcome Congresswoman Ann Wagner, who has served as co-chair during our 2 previous conferences on human trafficking. And we welcome in person to open our conference, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's with us for the first time this year. A senior member of the House of Representatives, Congressman Smith is co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and ranking member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. He is the special representative on human trafficking by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. His most significant legislative achievements include the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, our country's first national anti-trafficking law, and several subsequent anti-trafficking laws. These laws have influenced many countries to adopt their own anti-trafficking laws and to create a global movement to eradicate the scourge of human trafficking and violence against women. Thank you, Representative Smith, for joining us.
Thank you, Larry, so very much. Larry, thank you for your very strong words, and thank you for everyone that's here on this webinar. You know, words are inadequate to convey my respect and gratitude for the amazing work you are doing to end modern day slavery and to rescue victims of both sex and labor trafficking. Like you, I believe we have a duty to act, to shine a bright light on these egregious human rights violations, and to eagerly accept Jesus's challenge to hunger and thirst for righteousness, and to recognize and help those, as we would the Lord himself, who have been forced to be the least of our brethren. As you mentioned, last October 28th marked the 20th anniversary of a law that I authored, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Though it is hard to believe now, when I first introduced the act in the 1990s, the legislation was met with a wall of skepticism and outright opposition, dismissed by many as a solution in search of a problem. For most people at that time, including lawmakers, the term applied trafficking to almost exclusively to drugs and weapons, not human beings. Reports of vulnerable persons, especially women and children, being reduced to commodities for sale were often met with surprise, incredulity, or indifference. With a tremendous push from the faith-based community, especially the Catholic Church, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 was enacted into law, and it created a new whole of government domestic and international strategy and established numerous new programs to protect victims, prosecute traffickers, and to the greatest extent possible, prevent it in the first place, the 3 Ps. It included a number of sea change criminal code reforms, including treating as a victim and not a perpetrator of a crime anyone exploited by a commercial sex act who had not attained the age of 18, and anyone older where there was an element of force, fraud, or coercion. Thousands of human traffickers have been prosecuted and jailed pursuant to the act, including all charges brought against Jeffrey Epstein and the infamous convictions involving Smallville actress Allison Mack and the 120-year jail sentence for Keith Raniere's, part of that Nixon cult. And the TVPA established the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking, bringing all the parts of the government to bear. Everybody is a part of it. The U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office, the annual TIP report with its tiered grading of every nation's record in making serious and sustained efforts to eliminate human trafficking. As you know, those relegated to what we call Tier 3 are subject to sanctions. The act also included sheltering and a national hotline, and on the refugee side, created a new asylum category, the T visa, to protect victims and their families. You know, have visited trafficking victim shelters here and all over the world, including in Russia, Bolivia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Romania, Ukraine, Italy, Greece, and more. In Lima, Peru, for example, the Catholic sisters showed my delegation how they not only brought the good news of the gospel to broken young women, but taught them life skills and job training as well. It was clear that despite their severe trauma, many of those girls and young women were filled with that kind of joy that surpasses all understanding. In Rome, I met a Nigerian young woman who described how her journey to hope and renewal from the streets began when she got into Sister Eugenia Bonetti's rescue van and then to her shelter. Victims, I believe, have no better friend than you who are on this webinar. Meanwhile, while all of us are focused on combating COVID, one highly disturbing fact has emerged. The pandemic has put women and children everywhere at higher risk of exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, and has done so by making it more difficult to assist both current victims and survivors, by heightening insecurity of victims as government and philanthropic funds are refocused on other priorities and personnel are diminished, by making it more challenging to ensure a sustained and robust criminal justice response, and by prevalent spikes in grooming by predators of children who are not able to attend school and who are online now more than ever. All of us, especially parents, must talk with their kids and empower them to know the signs and resist. As we emerge from the pandemic, we need to prepare for and redouble our efforts to prevent and prosecute a likely explosion of pent-up predator demand. As I think many of you know, in 2019, I authored another law called the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act to educate school staff and recognize and respond to the signs of sex and labor trafficking, and to provide age-appropriate information to students on how to avoid becoming a victim. Such programs are a critically important way to inform, enlighten, and warn our young people, making them situationally aware and hopefully preventing and reducing the number of future victims. Situation awareness training, as you know, has made hotel, airline, bus, truck, and train personnel and others more likely to recognize and thwart human trafficking. You know, women and girls, as you know, are disproportionately abused by forced labor and account for the majority of the victims in the commercial sex industry. However, a 2013 report from ECPAC USA titled, "And Boys Too," concluded that the scope of the commercial exploitation of boys is vastly underreported. Some of you I know are very familiar with that 2016 study commissioned by the US Department of Justice that found up to 36% of the children forced into the US sex industry were male. Finally, in 2008, I introduced the International Megan's Law. It passed the House in 2010, 2014, 2016, and thankfully finally cleared the US Senate and was signed into law in 2016, 8 years later. Megan Kanka was from my hometown of Hamilton, just 7 years old when she was kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered in 1994. Her assailant lived across the street. Unbeknownst to her family and other residents in the neighborhood, he was a convicted repeat child sex offender. Megan's heartbroken to this day parents, Maureen and Richard Kanka, two very close friends, have been amazingly effective in successfully pushing every state in the union, including New Jersey and some foreign countries, to enact Megan's Law. So why International Megan's Law? We know from law enforcement, academia, and media documentation that Americans on the US sex offender registries are frequently caught sexually abusing children in Asia, Central and South America, Africa, Europe, and frankly, everywhere. The inherent secrecy of international travel enables child exploitation. Now under International Megan's Law, a major prevention strategy, convicted child sex offenders who travel abroad must provide notice to the US government via the Angel Watch Center prior to departure of all planned destinations. Failure to do so carries a significant jail term, commensurate with a convicted child sex abuser not reporting to local law enforcement. Upon receipt of the travel itinerary, the US government informs the destination country or countries of those plans. The destination country or countries are then empowered with actionable information to render the child predator inadmissible. More than 13,000 notifications have been made since enactment, and some 5,500 have been denied entry. Concerned that some may fail to include their true destination, in other words, put countries down where they're going, but not the real destination, and out of an abundance of caution and concern for kids, their passports contain the following message that will not likely go unnoticed by border agents. And I quote it: "The bearer was convicted of a sex offense against a minor and is a covered sex offender pursuant to 22 U.S. Code Section 212B. To conclude, so much has been accomplished by each of you, and of course, much more remains to be done. But the enormous challenge before us is to not grow weary in doing good, but through prayer and fasting, constantly renew our hope in God, continue as you have, to show much love and empathy for the weakest and the most vulnerable, as we commit and recommit to running with endurance the race fixed before us." Thank you so very much.
And thank you for your inspiring and insightful remarks, Congressman Smith.
Thank you, Larry.
We greatly appreciate it. I now welcome forward my good friend, Sister Ann Scholz, who will serve as our MC for the day. Sister Ann is a member of the School Sisters of Notre Dame and is the Associate Director for Social Mission at the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Sister Ann.
Thank you, Larry. And I want to personally welcome each of you and the more than 450 people from across the United States and around the world who've registered for this conference. Thank you for taking time on this International Women's Day to join this critically important discussion of the root causes of human trafficking. International Women's Day is a time to reflect on progress made, to call for needed change, and to celebrate acts of courage and determination by ordinary women who, like you, have played an extraordinary role in the struggle to achieve gender equality and to end human trafficking. So let me also offer a special thanks to the staff of the National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. It is your vision and your continued hard work that makes this conference possible. And finally, we're deeply grateful to our co-sponsors, the Columban Center for Advocacy and Outreach, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas Justice Team, U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of Migration and Refugee Services. Thank you all for your generous support of this effort. So as you've seen from the program, this is a conference that will extend over 2 days. Today will afford us the opportunity to shine the light on the horror of human trafficking. Sister Winifred Doherty will help us examine the root causes of the continued commodification and exploitation of our brothers and sisters. We'll welcome 2 sets of panelists, the first to discuss labor trafficking and the second to help us examine sex trafficking. We'll also hear some brief remarks, recorded remarks from 2 of our other congressional honorary co-chairs. And finally, we'll take some time to learn a little bit about how we might advocate for state and national legislation to address the root causes of human trafficking. Tomorrow, the shorter of the 2 days, we will share information about tangible and very manageable ways that you can get involved and engage your local communities in action to end human trafficking. And we hope there will be time for questions and answers after each panel. And now it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, my friend, and today's keynoter, Sister Winifred Doherty. Winifred is a Good Shepherd sister from Ireland who represents the Good Shepherd Sisters and Mission Partners at the United Nations since 2008. A social worker by profession, Winifred worked in Ethiopia for 16 years, empowering girls and young women through education and microfinance programs. She worked with them to confront extreme poverty and the many discriminatory practices that plagued their lives: FGM, early marriage, kidnapping, gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. At the UN, Winifred collaborates with other NGO representatives on policy issues, including poverty eradication, ending prostitution, human trafficking, and violence against women and girls. Winifred has taken leadership in many UN committees, including the UN NGO Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons. So Winifred will shine the light on the root causes and the many intersections that lead to human trafficking, reflecting especially on how the COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated the multiple inequities that exist in our societies, and showing how various push and pull factors continue to exploit desperate people, dehumanizing, commodifying them for pleasure and profit. If now is not the time to act on what the light has revealed, when will that time be? So Winifred, it's my great pleasure to welcome you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sister Anne, conference organizers and co-sponsors for your warm welcome. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists, IT technicians who are supporting us, and esteemed attendees on Zoom. Thank you for inviting me to share with you today, International Women's Day 2021. And I take this opportunity to wish each and every one of you a very happy International Women's Day. And yet, for so many girls and women, it is not a happy day, as girls and women, for the most part, do not experience gender justice or have their dignity upheld. You will hear some of these experiences during this webinar. The theme for today is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. Let me share one statistic with you. Women are heads of government or states in 22 countries. Only 24.9% of national parliamentarians are women. At the current rate of progress, according to UN Women, gender equality among heads of government will take another 130 years. It is my privilege to join you again this year at your annual Shine the Light Human Trafficking Conference, focusing on root causes and intersections. We're very familiar with the term trafficking, meaning to deal or trade in something illegal. When the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was in process, a preliminary version of the collated findings had trafficking in ivory, drugs, weapons, wildlife, and people in the same sentence. I remember feeling outraged at this. But today, as I recall that particular incident, I realize that we have a new and deeper consciousness of the interconnected web of all existence. A mentality of wheeling, dealing, or commodifying any life forms is contrary to living from an ethical stance, which acts from values, upholding the sacredness and the interconnectedness of all life, dignity, mutuality, respect, the common good, and sustainability. We read in scripture and we sing from our hymnals, "Let your light shine." No one lights a candle to put it under a bushel, but rather puts it on the light stand to give light to all in the house. Shine the light. Has COVID-19 been a light? What have we seen and experienced during this pandemic? COVID-19 has revealed fault lines in society, showing ever more clearly the structural and systemic issues that we have known, ignored, or chosen not to address. COVID-19 has exposed and exploited overlapping inequalities, as well as weaknesses in our social, economic, and political systems, and is now threatening to undo and reverse years of human development. The global public health crisis that is COVID-19 is intersecting with and exacerbating gender injustice, while furthering economic inequalities within countries and between countries. COVID-19 has been a wake-up call with regard to our interconnectedness across the planet. Another threat is looming: climate change, the most dire threat humanity has ever known. The COVID-19 virus has not respected international borders, and neither do carbon emissions and the impacts of climate change. The climate crisis has emerged from a reality in which those who benefit from our globalized economy are not the same people who suffer the impacts, some of whom are victims of human trafficking. In the US, the system and structures that favor the few and disadvantage the many are clearly illustrated in the following. The total wealth of US billionaires reached 4 trillion, over 1 trillion of which has been gained since the beginning of the pandemic, between March 18, 2020 and January 18, 2021. And contrast this with the difficulty in getting a stimulus package of 1.9 trillion passed for the well-being of people. Black Lives Matter. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, another light was shining in the Black Lives Matter movement. This has shone a light that white privilege and white supremacy are unfair and harmful to those who have it and to those who do not. Scenes of how George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many before and after them are treated led to an outcry to dismantle systems and structures that are inhuman and unjust. Currently, our social, economic, and political systems are inherently unjust and perpetuate exploitation and death to people and the planet. For me, I sum up the root causes under 5 Ps: pleonexia, privilege, pleasure, power, and profit. The current systems and structures are the carriers of these root causes and are the raison d'etre for human trafficking, for labor and sexual exploitation. And these intersect with persons in poverty who are vulnerable, marginalized, dark-skinned, migrant, and disproportionately impacting girls and women. Female victims continue to be particularly affected by trafficking in persons. The United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime published its global report on trafficking in persons 2020 at the end of this January. According to the report, in 2018, for every 10 victims detected globally, about 5 were adult women and 2 were girls. About 1/3 of the overall detected victims are children, both girls and boys, and we heard the Congressman reference that, while 20% were adult men. The characteristics of child trafficking and its underlying drivers seem to differ according to geographical and social contexts. Trafficked children detected in low-income countries are more likely to be exploited in forced labor, whereas trafficked children detected in high-income countries are more frequently trafficked for sexual exploitation. The systems of militarization, globalization, corporatization, financialization, commodification, and today digitalization are organized around the 5 Ps. They are embedded in the macroeconomic system and the financialization of markets, all of which serve to increase wealth for the few while exploiting and disempowering the many. The COVID-19 light shows this very clearly when it comes to vaccine production and distribution, and the lack of concern and political will to care for the well-being of every global citizen and all humanity. The UNODC Global Report on Trafficking in Persons has a thematic chapter that explores the role that socio-economic factors play in increasing susceptibility to trafficking, both at individual and national levels, and which in turn shape both recruitment and exploitative practices. Economic determinants such as poverty, unemployment, low income levels are all identified as among the most relevant risk factors affecting victims' susceptibility to trafficking in persons, and explains the social dynamics that govern trafficking in persons. With regard to economic need at the recruitment stage, the report indicates that of 233 trafficking in persons court cases, the majority of victims were reportedly in a condition of economic need, characterized by an inability to meet basic needs, such as food, shelter, or healthcare. traffickers deceptively presented solutions to alleviate these conditions of economic need, offering jobs, greater financial stability, better living conditions, or better social status. Persons who are victims of human trafficking are also affected by other conditions perceived as disadvantageous within their social context. The most commonly reported types of disadvantage were having a dysfunctional family and mental, behavioral, or neurological disorder. And these were associated with economic need. It was further noted that the emotional attachment of female victims to their traffickers was linked with having a dysfunctional family. Typical examples of structural disadvantage include being migrant, being a woman, and being a child. The gender dimension is especially relevant when assessing how economic need and structural advantage may affect an individual's vulnerability to trafficking. The individuals experienced a reduced range of opportunities and hence may have a higher level of acceptance of exploitative practices that constitute trafficking when compared to other groups. The current dominant economic system, sometimes called neoliberal capitalism, is a system that privileges capital and profit over life, promoting privatization, financialization, and generating precariousness of life for people and planet. Neoliberal capitalism is promoting free trade, contributes to the deterioration in a country's economic outlook, and may result in an increased flow of migrant workers. This increased flow of migrant workers can overlap with trafficking in person flows, thus increasing the number of trafficked persons. Embedded in this neoliberal capitalist economy is commercial sexual exploitation, the sex trade, and the porn industry, all of which is an assault on the person and the dignity of the person. The push from within so many circles towards full decriminalization of the sex industry is a fatal blow to girls' rights, women's rights, and gender equality. Advocacy for the full decriminalization of the sex industry amounts to the corporate, patriarchal, criminal, and neoliberal capitalist capture of the gender equality agenda. It should be recognized that the economic determinants represent only one of several driving factors. Other key elements that predispose people to being trafficked include community systems breakdown, displacement, the occurrence of conflict, human-made and natural disasters. Some build upon the structural conditions of disadvantage and oppression, such as migration policy issues, gender and race-based discrimination, political structures and systems that devalue and exclude women and girls, the reduction of social and policy space, as well as spending in favor of austerity measures, and in the continuance of traditions and practices that encourage abusive and exploitive practices. And in the UNODC report, again, there is a chapter entitled Traffickers Use the Internet, Digital Hunting Fields, where they describe traffickers as actively hunting those they deem as vulnerable to falling victim to trafficking, or passively fishing for potential victims by posting advertisements and waiting for potential victims to respond. Traffickers are advertising deceptive job offers, marketing exploitative services to potential paying customers while recruiting victims. Patterns of exploitation have been transformed by digital platforms as webcams and live streams have created new forms of exploitation and reduced the need for transportation and transfer of victims. I want to conclude by recognizing the tremendous work you do at the policy and service level to counter human trafficking, both for labor and sexual exploitation. But I wish to challenge you to engage in newer levels of advocacy to address systems and structures, the very carriers of injustice. They are currently operative in many of the jargon terms I used at the beginning: globalization, militarization, financialization, commodification, and now digitalization. And all of these privilege the few while creating and exploiting the vulnerable among us. Meeting needs is important. Highlighting the issues of exploitation in human trafficking is important. But we need to connect with and challenge the very system that perpetuates such abuses, exploitation, and injustice, including gender inequality. We must look at the big picture, the interconnectedness of the web of all existence, the planet and its peoples. We must raise our voices for new systems and structures that seek to uphold the sacredness of life through advocating for care economies, gender justice, eco-justice, and social justice. If we do not do this, we are merely addressing symptoms and not the root causes. Once we make the connection, once we see the intersections, we move beyond the symptoms. Then we are truly on a journey of change. Mahatma Gandhi said, "The world has enough resources for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed." Pleonexia. There is no easy answer, but we can raise our voice. We must challenge our political, social, and economic systems, and perhaps hope. With the light of the COVID-19, are we able to usher in a new world order, new economies built on care, inclusion, and gender justice? If now is not the time to act on what the light has revealed, when will that time be? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winifred, for so clearly placing our work of these next 2 days within the larger context of the multiple inequities and the continuing exploitation that we see all around us. We know that we have what it takes to make the changes that must be made. And as you said so clearly, if now is not the time to act on what the light has revealed, when will that time be? So thank you again for being with us. And now Sister Winifred will be joined by our first panel of the day, which will focus on labor trafficking. Economic profit and the devaluation of the human person are at the center of labor trafficking. And we know that that situation is compounded by racial inequity, forced migration, failed economic systems, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we add our panelists to the screen, let me introduce each of them to you. Deanna Fimbress serves as the program manager for the Strategic Initiative on Labor Trafficking at Polaris, a data-driven social justice movement to fight sex and labor trafficking. Deanna has worked on projects building a safety net for trafficking victims in the United States and Mexico. Currently, she focuses on labor trafficking issues in the agricultural sector. Prior to joining the team at Polaris, she worked with underserved and migrant youth, providing scholarships and pathways to higher education. Welcome, Deanna.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sister Christine Trong is a Good Shepherd sister. Born in South Vietnam, she worked with street children and poor women in Saigon. After Saigon fell, she served as a group counselor in Macau and Hong Kong, ministering to teenagers with family problems. While in Hong Kong, she also worked with Caritas Internationales, serving thousands of refugees in detention camps. Now Christine ministers in Atlanta, where she is the founder of Good Shepherd Services, which provides immigration services, counseling, domestic violence intervention, translation service, and much, much more. Sister Christine, we're so glad you could join us. And our third panelist this afternoon is Flor Molina. Flor has been an advocate for policies to combat human trafficking since 2002. She's a founding member of the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking Survivor Leadership Program and a member of the National Survivors Network. Flor has served on the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking and is a recipient of the Free the Slaves Fashion Freedom Award. Flor is a woman who went from being trafficked from Mexico to the United States for labor in the garment industry to becoming one of the true champions for trafficking survivors. Flor, thank you for joining us today all the way from Mexico. You are all most welcome. And before I turn this back to my friend Winifred, who will moderate our panel, let me invite you to write any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We ask only that you please keep your question brief, making sure that it is in the form of a question so that we can answer as many of those as time permits. So Winifred, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for formally introducing our esteemed panelists. If I may, I am going to call you by your first names, Deanne, Sister Christina, and Flor. A warm welcome to each of you. And our panelists are going to present from their broad experiences addressing the issue of labor trafficking in this panel. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to hand over to Deanne, and don't forget to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. I had a slide deck. I don't know if that's going to be available to be presented, but if not, I can go ahead and start speaking. As it was previously mentioned, my name is Diana Fimbress, and I'm the program manager for the strategic initiative at labor trafficking at Polaris. And today I'll be really talking more broadly about what labor trafficking looks like, and then I'll focus in a little bit on the health and beauty industry. I know Sister Christine will be talking about that as well, so just providing some framework for that conversation. And then I'll talk about how and why this happens, and what are some of the barriers we see for victims and survivors to obtain help. Before I get started, just a little bit about Polaris and what we do. So we serve victims and survivors through operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We also help building data sets to understand how human trafficking really works. It's a really complex issue and crime, and so trying to untangle that is quite a feat. And then we use that knowledge to have strategies to try and disrupt the root causes of trafficking. Next slide. So what is human trafficking? So you'll see on your screen right there the definition provided in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And so I'm pretty sure all of you, if not most of you, are familiar with this definition of trafficking. that talks about basically an action, right? Someone being recruited or transported by a means, force, fraud, and coercion for the purpose of some type of exploitation, whether it be sex or labor. And so what I want to highlight for this definition is sort of how do we break that down? One is there has to be force, fraud, and coercion, right, at the core. And there has to be money or something of value involved, right? And at the end of the day, this is a dynamic that relies on power, vulnerability, and profit, right? If we think of the larger factors in play, that's what human trafficking really is about. Next slide, please. And so you'll see here, speaking more to that, right, that human trafficking is a very complex crime, and it doesn't occur in a vacuum. A lot of times we hear in the narratives around human trafficking that it's sort of this like moment in time, but it's not, right? It's actually, and unfortunately, a predictable end to social, political, and economic inequities that leave some people with too much power and others with too little, right? And so when that happens, you know, traffickers will step in and meet those unmet needs, right? And those unmet, unfulfilled needs that a person may have. We also like to look at trafficking as the outcome of other systems failing, right? So the housing system, food security, welfare, education, right? And what we see is that these systems usually fail people of color, they fail the trans community, they fail immigrants and other marginalized groups. I mean, they can fail anyone, but in particular, they affect these communities. And so therefore, and to what Winifred was saying, right, the fight against trafficking is very much linked to the fight for equity, to the fight against racism, sexism, discrimination, and oppression, right? And so when we talk about fighting human trafficking and the causes of it, we also have to look at these systems that enable them. And we have to think about how we start empowering people, right? And how we change that dynamic in which that power imbalance is shifted. Next slide. So here you'll see some of the industries reported for labor trafficking. In 2017, Polaris released the typology of labor trafficking, and it includes 25 industries where trafficking was reported. And I do want to emphasize that part. This is by any means an all-inclusive list. This is just based on the reporting we've gotten through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so if there's a type of trafficking that is not seen here, that's very much unlikely. Again, it's based on reporting and not necessarily prevalence. And so we identified 25 industries, again, where we had seen trafficking, and then 17 of those were actually in labor trafficking. And so you'll see some there. It's very different industries. A lot of times we think of human trafficking as, you know, happening in the shadows, only in illicit activities. And as you'll see there, it's a lot of very well-known industries, right? We're talking about restaurants and food services. We're talking about landscaping and agriculture, construction, domestic work, right? So it really does happen within legitimate industries. And today I'll be talking a little bit more about the health and beauty industry. Next slide. And so for the health and beauty industry, we actually have limited data on this. So we don't get a lot of reports. We've gotten all time about 400 cases within this industry. And by health and beauty, I mean nail salons, I mean barbershops, acupuncture. So we've gotten, like I said, around 400, and about half of those have occurred in nail salon. What the typology does, and I'd be more than happy to link the report later on, is it actually takes these industries and breaks them down, right? We know that trafficking may look different in different industries, so there might be a different type of trafficker profile, recruitment, and victim profile for each of the types. The dynamics are the same, but it may look different, right? We see in some types, the like I said, the victim changes, some may be more men, some more female, the recruitment may happen differently. And so what this does is try to break it down a bit to really develop strategies that are much more sort of focused. But in health and beauty services, what we see is that normally traffickers have an employer relationship with victims. Many of the victims that were reported to the hotline are from Vietnam and China. Many of the traffickers themselves were from Vietnam and China. And in a very small subset of cases, they were the victims like intimate partner. In terms of recruitment, it's no surprise that the data suggests high levels of fraud and deceit. So misrepresenting wages, right? False promises of work, really good working conditions, or offering an immigration status, right? Educational benefits to come work. And so this same recruitment fraud ends up being a form of control, right? And so when we look at the victims, most survivors tend to be from Vietnam and China, again, the ones that have been reported to us. A smaller proportion are also US citizens. And I think that's another sort of misconception, is that in labor trafficking or in trafficking in general, victims and survivors are only foreign, and we see that it's definitely both. I would also like to note that for victims, and in this type of trafficking in these venues, a lot of the information we have actually comes from community members. And I think that shows the importance of also being an active community members. A lot of times the victims and survivors themselves may not reach out, but community members might do so as well. And we also have seen in those sort of different subsets that some South Korean, primarily women, can also be victims of this crime. Next slide, please. And so when we think about what are some of the methods of control for the health and beauty industry in particular, we see that there's extensive work hours. We see that methods of control, including moving victims or being heavily monitored, isolation, and many victims may remain in that situation in hopes of the promised immigration or educational benefits that never materialize. But in a broader sense, why it's also very difficult for victims to ask help is because they're in a different context, right? And so if we're talking about foreign victims, right? Even just language, right? Language and lack of cultural and social familiarity. A really big one is mistrust of authority. So a lot of times we've seen that traffickers will basically tell victims that if they ask for help, they're going to get them deported and they're going to be the ones ending up in jail. So they instill a lot of fear. I think an important one to mention here too is shame and guilt. I feel like it may not be talked about as much, but people that get in these situations, a lot of them, they're most of them, right? They want to improve their situation, right? They want to have a better job. They want to have educational benefits, right? They may be paid a fee up front for this job. And so when that doesn't pan out, it may be really difficult to ask for help because there's this shame and a guilt attached of like, how is it that I fell for this, right? How did I not see this? And so we definitely see that as a factor. And again, why the role of community is important and of people around them to be a lifeline for them. Next up. And then lastly, I'll just do a little commercial break here that obviously there we are and we operate the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So just wanted to put that out there. We are a service that is 24/7. We have call, text, live chat, and it's available in more than 200 languages. So there is, again, help available, but I can't emphasize enough the role of community and in helping victims after that, and then going back, to improving those systems and improving the factors that contribute to people ending up in a situation of labor trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deanne. I have to say that Polaris is one of my star organizations, and it's the typology has been, I think, out a few years, and it has been a very helpful guide to me personally. So thank you for your sharing. And now we're going to turn to Sister Christine, and welcome, Christine. And Christine will bring an international perspective because she has a broad range of experiences from Vietnam to Macau to Hong Kong, and finally, well, I won't say finally, but now at Atlanta Good Shepherd Services, where she ministers with girls and women who are in difficult moments in their lives. Christine, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. I would like to share a story of one of the few victims that I had experienced to work with. Kim is a Vietnamese woman. She arrived in the US just over 2 years from Vietnam. She married a man whom she hardly knew. He was a customer at the nail salon where Kim's cousin worked, and Kim was helped by this cousin to marry him, with the hope that Kim could also find a job in a nail salon and support her family, since they are very poor in Vietnam. Her husband lived in the rural area in Georgia. During the first 2 weeks, Kim suffered homesickness, isolation, and fear. She did not have a telephone to contact her cousin or call to her family back in Vietnam to inform that she is safe. Every morning, her husband went out until late in the evening, and often he came home drunk and angry. After almost 4 months, Kim found work in a nail salon 5 miles away, and her husband drove her to work at 8 a.m. in the morning and took her home at 7 p.m. in the evening. Often he did not go home, but stay around, drinking and standing outside. He's waiting at 7 p.m. every evening. He will be there to pick her home. He was furious when Kim was not out on time. She was forbidden to talk or contact anyone, including her cousin. Her salary and tips were given to her husband every week. She had to cook, clean, and do everything in the house. All her personal documents, such as passport, social security card, and green card, etc., were kept by her husband. Other co-workers were curious about Kim. And one day, Kim told them her drunk husband sexually and physically abused her. They called me and gave Kim the contact number of Good Shepherd Services, Atlanta. We immediately called an Uber to pick Kim up from her working place and bring her to our center. Our staff then helped her to write the report and interpret it for her at the police station near our center, since she did not know the city where she lived with her husband. Kim returned to work, and fortunately, on that day, her husband was not drinking and checking on her at the nearby restaurant. 3 days later, Kim decided not to return to her husband. And all Vietnamese couples that we knew allowed Kim to stay with them after work. While we contacting the relevant investigation units and immigration officers, and we get the replacement of green card and visa for Kim. We also providing counseling, and we help her to get a lawyer. And also, she also got a job in another nail salon. Today, Kim is much happier. She's working and looking forward to visit her family in Vietnam after the pandemic is over. So some of the people might ask, how did the Kim know us, and how the people who work in the nail salon knows us? Because we in Atlanta, we are a community-based center, and we serve the needy regardless of ethnicity, gender, or religious belief. We're providing programs that bring hope, restore dignity, and improve life. And we will continue to go to work with the poor people, the voiceless people in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Christine. And you bring your own peculiar Good Shepherd charism to the encounter with individual persons. And you showed this in your sharing of the woman that you were engaged with in terms of helping her identify the violence in her life and providing strategies for her to move out of that violent situation. So thank you again. And now we're going to turn to our third panelist, who is actually on the phone. So we're very happy to have Flo with us. And she is, I know we're all great women, but today, I think it being International Women's Day, I have to say that she is an outstanding woman leader, and has taken a cause that she has experienced, taken it to heart, and is indeed shining the light as an advocate, and a strong advocate. So Flor, you're welcome, and please unmute yourself and talk to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, sisters, to be today at this conference, Shining the Light. I feel so honored. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I know I have a few minutes to talk, and can someone remind me if I'm getting close to finishing my time? Because I think I get excited sometimes when I'm speaking, and I tend to forget.
We'll be happy to.
Thank you. First of all, is the sound okay? Or do I have to speak louder, or it's fine?
The sound is perfect.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience as a survivor, a survivor now, but when I was in the situation. And I love the title today because it says Shine the Light and root causes of human trafficking. But first of all, shine the light. It really touches my heart because when I was in the situation, I felt as I was in darkness with no hope and no way to turn to. So this title, it really, really touches my heart. And I feel so honored for many, many reasons. Today, as you mentioned, is International Women's Day. It's my grandma's 10th anniversary. She passed away 10 years ago, but she was my hero. She was my mentor, my everything. She was my real mom. So I'm not sad. I thank God for her life, and she lasted very, very long. I think she deserved to rest in peace, but I wanted to share that with you. The root causes of human trafficking. For me, root causes for human trafficking, first of all, are poverty and no decent jobs. When in the majority of the cases, women are the providers and the hearts of the families. And in my case, I was going through the really difficult time back then, and that's why I was so easy target to my trafficker. I was a desperate mother, escaping domestic violence and trying to provide a better life to my 3 children. I had lost my youngest baby. I couldn't take her to a better hospital and ending with her life, she passed away. I took her only to the local clinic, but because I didn't have money to take her to a better hospital, she passed away. Because in the village, in the rural area, we have no real doctors. We have only students who go there and really practicing with people's lives. And that was the case with my baby. So ultimately, my baby passed away, and I was so sad, and I got depressed and worried. What would I do if any of the other boys get sick? I didn't have money, and I already lost one. I didn't want to lose any of the other 3 that were alive. Around this time, someone contacted my sewing teacher because due to the depression, because I was going through a really, really deep depression. My doctor advised me not to stay home alone. Instead, he said, go out and speak with the neighbor or, do something. So I decided to take sewing classes, and I studied, but these classes are expensive for the materials that we had to use. So I started working, even though I had 2 jobs, cooking at a restaurant, and during the weekends, I would, sell tamales. It wasn't enough to feed my children, because if I buy a pair of shoes, I didn't have money for food. Or the other way, if I buy food, I didn't have money for shoes or anything else. And deep inside of me was the worriness. What would I do if any of them get sick? So around this time, someone contacted my sewing teacher, and she came to my house to tell me about this great opportunity to go to the United States. And I always mention this because I think this is important. People who go to the United States and come back to the country, they never share about the struggles. They share and they talk only about the marvelous part. How easy it is to get the money, how things are so easy to get, but they never tell the truth, how difficult it is to get the first job, how difficult it is to get around, how difficult it is to even learn how to use the money, because it's a different country, it's a different culture, but people don't talk about it. So when my sewing teacher came to tell me about this great opportunity, it sounded really, really good. And I hadn't ever been really far from my village. The farthest part I had been was Mexico City. It's like about 5 hours driving or going by bus. It's the farthest way I have been. I hadn't been, other or out of the country. So for me, this opportunity was great. I thought, and I told her, but I don't have any money. She said, don't worry about it. Everything is paid for, and when we get there, we will have a place where to live, and we will have a job, which was really, really important. And since people don't talk about it, and I hadn't ever been out of the country, in my mind, I thought I'm going only for 6 months. I want to save $5,000, which back then were like 50,000 pesos. And around this time, I had already my goal. My goal was to start my sewing company, because the majority of women here in the village, they knew or they know how to sew, but there are no places to work. So I thought, why not? I go to the United States, I save my 50,000 pesos, and I can come back and start my business. I didn't know about any risk. I didn't, I was 29 years old back then. I wasn't that young, but believe me, I was innocent because I hadn't ever been out. And, I always mention also that TV programs back then didn't talk about human trafficking or any risks, nothing like that. There was no information. There was no way to think like something would happen to me. So sounds everything good. They asked me for my documentation, and I thought it's weird, but they said they needed my information and my documents because they were going to buy the plane ticket, and I thought, well, it sounds normal. So from Mexico City to Tijuana, I took the flight, and in Tijuana, I thought I was already in the United States, but they told me, no, we are not in the United States. We are at the border. And I'm like, okay. And as I mentioned, I'd never been out, and I hadn't ever heard anything of the struggles or anything about crossing the border. There, I met my trafficker. My trafficker wasn't nice. She was a female. She was around 60 years old, something like that. She was older. She wasn't young, and she wasn't nice. She told me she needed my documents, which I didn't have. Of course, I had already given them my documents. And I asked her why. She said, because for my safety. I'm like, okay. She knows better because she's been out of the country for many years. And she introduced me to a person who was going to help me to cross the border. I got to the United States. It was dark. It was the ending of 2001. It was dark. It was raining. I didn't know where, they dropped me off. And then my trafficker came, picked me up in a van, took me to her house. The following morning, New Year of 2002, early in the morning, they woke me up. They said I had to work before we got to the factory. So we had to wash the cars, and then they took us to the factory. The factory was huge. There were like 60 to 70 big sewing machines, and there was no people working because it was New Year. And she showed me and told me my responsibilities. At no moment she told me when was going to be my day off or how much she was going to pay me. She made sure I understood my chores, my obligations, but she never mentioned how much money she was going to pay me or when was going to be my day off. And I knew I was in a different country already. I didn't want to make her angry, so I didn't ask any question. And for the first 3 days, she would take me. We were three. The sewing teacher was with me all this time, so she would take us to her house. But in the 3 days, my trafficker and her crew about 8 women decided that we had to sleep in the factory because she said that the time we were using to go and come back to her house, we were wasting her time, and she had brought us to the United States for work. And then she also told me that I have a huge debt, around $3,000, and I had to work to pay her back. So I thought it's fair because she had used her money to bring me over. And then after 3 days, she decided that I had to sleep in the factory, and she left a person to monitor me overnight and make sure I didn't escape. She told me I wasn't allowed to talk to my coworkers because my coworkers would have envy of me because she was paying me so good, even though she never mentioned how much money she was going to pay me or anything. And I would work 17 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. I wasn't able to put one step out of the factory because she said if I go outside, I would put her at risk, and authorities would put me in jail because I was illegally in the country. And if I go to the authorities, they would not believe me. Instead, they would put me in jail, and in jail there is a lot of people, bad people, and they would do something really bad to me, and I would never see my children again. Then she started punishing me because she wanted me to work harder and harder, and fast and fast. So she would pull my hair, pinch me, slap me, all kind of different punishments. And she would humiliate me in front of my coworkers, making me feel bad of, the place where I'm coming from, how I look, how I talk, everything. And I was there for 40 days. And she said if I had to prove her that I deserved to be there and I deserve anything, so the longer hours I worked, it was better. And I haven't been out of the factory, but before I left, I have promised God, if I ever make it to the United States, the first thing I would do is to go and thank God in a temple. So I never forgot my promise to God. And I asked her if she would let me to go to a church. Even though I had never been outside of the factory, I would listen to the conversations of my coworkers and saying that, nearby there was a Catholic church. So I started asking her to go to a church, and she said I had to earn the permission. So I had to show her that I deserved to get the permission to go out. And I started working longer hours. Sometimes I would go to bed like 1 or 3 in the morning, depending, to show her that I really, really wanted to go to a church. To my surprise, one day, I think she got tired because I was so insistent. She said that I would not give up. So finally, she let me go to a church. It was Sunday, February 10, 2002, when she allowed me to go to a church. So I walked out of the factory, and to my surprise, that day, nobody was monitoring my movement. So I decided to escape and not to go back, even though I was so scared and I didn't know anybody. But I think I had been so blessed that I met, the first person I met was a person from Chirla. And then Chirla, the coalition of the Coalition for Human Immigrants' Rights of LA. Later on, this organization introduced me to CAST. And I think this is really important because my case was in early 2002, and human trafficking wasn't a topic as it is now. In year 2000, and the TV Protection Act was passed, but it was a new law. Law enforcement didn't know much about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and they didn't know how to typify my case. Because it was a new case, one of the new cases for the authorities, they only charged my trafficker as an abuser employer, got a light sentence of 6 months of house arrest, but that was because she had lied to authorities. And when she finished her house arrest, she visited my family in Mexico. She visited my mother, gave her $20 for my mother when she found out where I was to tip her. And since then, she was looking for me. And that's the reason my life was always at risk, and I had to live for many years in hiding because my trafficker was looking for me. One other important thing is that she's from the same village where I am from, where people know each other, but and she had connections. One of her threats also was that if I escape or I tell authorities, she said that nobody would believe me because she's a U.S. citizen. She has money and she has connections. She has connections in the U.S. and in Mexico. And since I was illegally in the country, nobody would believe me. And she said that even dogs have more rights in the United States than I had. She said, if I kill a dog, I would get in trouble. But if I kill you, nobody would care because nobody knows where you are at, which was true. But after I escaped and after meeting these organizations, Chirla and CAS, I decided, and there at CAS, I met other survivors, and I decided to start sharing my story to prevent others from falling into trafficking as I was. Because if someone had told me that these things exist, of course, I wouldn't have put my life at risk going to the United States, to a different country, and then going and speaking before I doubted myself if someone believed me, because I believed what my trafficker told me. But going and speaking and telling people what happened to me, people little by little were encouraging me and telling me that I was putting a face into the issue. And I had a lot of self-doubt. But later on, when I had the opportunity to testify for AB 22, the first law that criminalizes human trafficking in California, and later on speaking and getting in the audience and saying that we all have a play to role as consumers, as human beings. And then when they introduced SB 657, the Supply Chain Transparency Bill, and later on AB 15, the Bill of Rights, and see that really my voice has an echo. And there were people who were eager and were allies fighting against human trafficking. That really, really empowered me. And I think nowadays we have made a huge change. And I thank the United States because it was a foreign nation that gave me hope and believed that this issue exists and started doing something to change the view in the heart of people to fight human trafficking. So later on, to my surprise, in year 2015, President Barack Obama selected survivor leaders from around the world, but based in the United States, and formed the first advisory council on human trafficking. And our job there was to advise the President's Interagency Task Force on how to find better ways to combat human trafficking. I think we have come a long way, and I think my voice was heard. And I think, in a way, we are today together, and thank you for inviting me, and we are shining the light into the darkness. Because when victims are in trafficking, they have no hope, they have no faith, no hope, no way to go or to move around. But thanks to good people like today, Alice here, having this conference, I think we are shining the light, and hopefully one day there will be no more human trafficking. I feel so honored to have been part of this conference. And if there are questions, I'm willing to answer them. I think I'm going to end up here.
Thank you very much, Flo, for outlining so clearly your experiences. But much more important for me is how you have used those experiences and been a light shining for so many other women and girls who have and are experiencing trafficking. So in the few minutes, I would just like to bring together what the panelists have said. And I think there was a certain flow in what they presented, but I heard very clearly Deanne speak about traffickers meeting needs, the needs of the people. And my question is, why are the traffickers meeting their needs and not the governments of the countries where they are? And then I think we heard Christina share in terms of how empowerment happens through having a safe space and having people to relate to. And the key here is accepting the person as a person with dignity and rights. And then I think we move to hear Flor again addressing the same issue from her own perspective and bringing it forward in terms of the advocacy work that needs to be done. But I will again bring us back to, yes, governments need to take responsibility. And so why not have social protection? Why not have basic income? Why is there such political resistance to such measures, which would be a step in empowering people economically? And if people are empowered economically, they already experience themselves as of worth. And why have people to leave their own country? Again, we have to look at human rights abuses, and throughout all of this, the dehumanizing of the person. We've heard this from all of the speakers, the person dehumanized, humiliated, treated as a nobody, as a no person. So whatever we can do in our advocacy to highlight the dignity of the person, but also to advocate for economic policies, for the sharing of the wealth of the world with the peoples of the world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Winifred. And thank you, Deanna, Christine, and Flora as well. We did get some questions. We have a little bit of time to try to answer. So I'm going to group the questions and then invite any one of the four of you to respond to each of the questions that I ask. So let me start with this. Quite honestly, sex trafficking seems to get more attention than labor trafficking gets, from the press, from legislators, from advocates as well. What do you wish more people understood about labor trafficking?
I can answer that.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
Okay. From my experience as a labor trafficking survivor is because sex trafficking gets more attention from the public. In my experience, when I speak about labor trafficking, when I mention trafficking, people immediately think about sex trafficking. I think because labor trafficking is ignored, it's not put there on the table, it's not on news, and people don't know. They only say, oh, it's labor abuse, but they don't typify it as labor trafficking. So because sex trafficking sells more, like, let's say, gets more like for media, gets more attention, sex trafficking, than labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is like put aside, like doesn't exist. But I think that's important to put the word out there and even for a law enforcement to look, not only from, the top, but look beneath the whatever is obvious. Look and search and see what is going on, especially because in the migrant, I can speak from the migrant perspective, is people are so scared of law enforcement and are scared that they are going to be deported. They don't come out and say, this is happening at my workplace.
Yeah, thank you, Flor, very much. Anybody else want to respond to that question?
I'd just like to add, Anne.
Sure, I think,
Go ahead, Deanne.
Deanna?
thank you. I was just going to add, I think, to expanding the sort of understanding around labor trafficking and how labor trafficking, this is also responding to one of the questions I saw in the Q&A, but it affects us obviously locally and also internationally, right? When we look at products that we buy, when we look at, to Flor, the clothes that we're wearing, the chocolate that we eat, we're all consuming on a day-to-day basis, right? What we eat, the products of labor trafficking. So I think that bringing greater awareness in that sense and also accountability is important, and making those connections with people, because to what Flor is saying, right, the narrative tends to focus more around sex trafficking, and labor trafficking is sort of on the wayside. And the thing I would add too is sometimes labor trafficking, it can seem more complex because of these longer supply chains, and it's sort of hidden in those ways, but the information is out there, and it's how also we deliver that and show people, hey, again, the chocolate you're eating, the strawberries you picked up at the grocery store, like there's might be labor trafficking in that. So I think, again, that part is quite important.
And I just add to that, we are all complicit. And I think our complicity is easier folded into what we buy, what we wear, the health services, the beauty services, etc. We all want that. So as Deanne said, we're a consumer, and because we consume, then we're not as critically conscious of what is in the background and how is this service provided to us.
So building from that, we've got a question about what strategies would you recommend to us then? How can we help to put an end to labor trafficking? Whether we're talking about global, are there global strategies we can use? Are there local, national strategies? How can we help both to raise awareness about the existence of labor trafficking, our own complicity in it, and then what the heck do we do?
I think that's why it's important, the supply chain bill, because as consumers, we can search and we can ask these companies, what are you doing to prevent human trafficking in your supply chain? The chocolate you are selling to me, it is free of slaves. The blouse you are selling to me is made where? And what are you doing to make sure, there's no slavery in the supply chain? The cotton that from where this blouse was made, and things like that. So that's why I think it is important to have in mind that we all have a role to play as consumers, as human beings.
Thank you all for your questions. I really do think that's all we can get to, and I am so disappointed that we don't have days to unpack the reality of labor trafficking, the pain that it causes, and as Sister Winifred pointed out so eloquently, our own role in that. So thank you all for your questions. I apologize to those of you whose questions we were unable to get to. I thank the panelists for sharing your experience and your expertise so freely with us this afternoon, and for the critically important work that you're doing each and every day to help end the abuse of labor trafficking. You are the women that we celebrate on this International Women's Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
so
now-
much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, each and every one of you. So now let's turn our attention to the first of two pre-recorded messages from another of our congressional co-chairs. I'd like to invite you to listen to a few remarks from Congressman James Mcgovern, a friend and a longtime supporter of our efforts to end human trafficking.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congressman Jim Mcgovern, Chairman of the House Rules Committee and co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in Congress. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today about the root causes of human trafficking and what our responsibility is in the United States to address this problem. I especially want to say thank you to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Advocacy Center of the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, the Columban Center for Advocacy and Outreach, and the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, and everyone who has helped to make this year's virtual conference a success. Thank you for all of your activism and advocacy. Thank you for shining a bright light on human trafficking and working to break the veil of indifference, as Pope Francis has called it, concerning this vital issue. Let's be clear about human trafficking. It is slavery. When a young boy is kidnapped and coerced into becoming a child soldier, that's slavery. When a young boy or girl is locked in a sweatshop, alone, abused, and incapable of leaving, that is slavery. When a young woman from a marginalized community in Honduras is forced to flee from her home for fear of being sold into sex slavery, only to be kidnapped and forced into prostitution as she tries to escape, that is slavery. And all too often, our debates on what can be done about human trafficking takes place in a vacuum, removed from the violence and poverty which too often has been exacerbated by America's own history of intervention and destabilization, particularly in places like Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and El Salvador. You know, my first visit to El Salvador was in the 1980s, early 1980s. While there, I saw firsthand how the United States government supported the brutality of the Salvadoran government and military toward its own people. I discovered we were an apologist for a military that massacred 1,000 people, including scores of children, at and around a village called El Mizote. I learned that during the 12-year civil war, over 75,000 civilians were killed, and an unknown number, likely in the thousands, were forcibly disappeared, mainly at the hands of state actors. And towards the end of that war, I watched as some of the highest officials of my country conferred medals on Salvadoran military officers, even after we knew they had given the orders to murder 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women, including the rector and faculty members of the University of Central America. Under Republican and Democratic administrations alike, the U.S. has made bad judgments and miscalculations that have had real and adverse consequences in the lives of real people, consequences that too often lead to human trafficking and violence in marginalized communities. But I have seen firsthand the many positive results when the U.S. instead collaborates with local communities, addresses the causes of youth violence, invests in community design development, helps professionalize security forces, facilitates safe and orderly migration for those most at risk, and supports institutions that strengthen judicial independence and an end to corruption and impunity. Policies that prioritize a better quality of life and respect the dignity of ordinary people and the poor give people a sense of control over their own lives, hope for a better future for their children, and a reason to remain in their own countries. A few years ago, I visited Honduras on a fact-finding delegation led by WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. We looked at the problems of violence and lack of opportunity in order to understand why families and young people continue to flee the country. We wanted to learn what the Honduran government and people were doing in response to the problems that confront their country and how the U.S. might help. What I saw is that violence and lack of opportunity are driving families and young people to flee Honduras, and often driving them into situations where they are at risk for human trafficking. I saw the marginal communities and heard the stories from families about the problems that young people faced. And I learned that often the best thing America can do is support efforts that break the cycle of violence and help build opportunities for youth in Central America. I also heard from returned migrants and the families of migrants, including those whose loved ones have disappeared and never been heard from again. Migrants face abuse as they travel. They are extorted by authorities in Mexico and sometimes Guatemala, and robbed or kidnapped and held for ransom by criminal groups. Young women run the risk of being trafficked and forced into prostitution. We heard from returned migrants, especially those who had been stopped in Mexico, about the return journey and the lack of services at the El Corinto border crossing. We met migrants who had fled gang violence only to be forced to return to the same dangers. I was moved by many of these stories. What I also discovered is how many local and community-based NGOs in El Salvador, in Honduras, and in Guatemala are actually dealing compassionately and effectively in providing protection, counseling, and recovery to children and families. Young people, women and girls, and even entire families who are fleeing the threat of trafficking or who have been traumatized by trafficking find shelter and support at these programs. We need to support their work, and we need to help them expand their services. I've also found similar organizations on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. I can't express how courageous and committed border communities are to protecting and supporting children, women, and families trapped between criminal organizations and the many obstacles thrown up by cruel and inhumane immigration policies. They also need our support, and they need our collaboration. I am grateful that after 4 years of cuts to the very aid programs that fund this work, we now have an administration that understands America's special obligation to do something about the violence, impunity, and human trafficking taking place in Central and South America. And I am hopeful because we finally have an administration that understands how these issues are all interconnected and understands that it is in our strategic and humanitarian interests to take action, to do something about it. So thank you for all of the work and the support and the education that you are doing on the issue of human trafficking. These vulnerable children, women, and families need our help and compassion. And shame on us if we don't provide it and do even more.
So thank you. Many thanks. We're most grateful for the Congressman's vision and his very honest assessment of our own government's complicity in creating conditions that force people from their homes and make people vulnerable to human trafficking. And of course, we're very grateful for his support for this conference and for serving as an honorary co-chair for today's events. So thank you again to Congressman James Mcgovern. So my friends, you've been very patient this morning. We have been, this afternoon, we've been this for a while. We think you've earned a 5-minute stand-up break. Take the next 5 minutes for yourself and mark your own time. Please be back here in my clock, on my computer. It would be 1:50 Eastern time. And we will pick up with the second panel, which will focus on sex trafficking. So please take a break. You can stay on the webinar. Simply turn off your video camera, and I assume you're still muted. So we'll see you in 5. Thank you. So welcome back. Our second panel today will address the reality and the brutality of sex trafficking. We know that women and children are especially vulnerable, and we know that boys and men can be as well, vulnerable to being trafficked for sex. And we know that here too, power and profit lie at the root. We know that marginalized communities are at greater risk of being trafficked and less likely to find support both before and after being exploited. So it's my great honor to welcome our panelists for this afternoon, who will help us unpack some of the various and sundry intersecting root causes of sex trafficking. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sister Norma Pimentel. Norma is a religious of the Missionaries of Jesus and serves as executive director and a licensed professional counselor for Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. There she provides oversight of the ministries and programs in the areas of emergency assistance, housing assistance, counseling, pregnancy care, and humanitarian aid. I'm proud to say that Norma is a past recipient of LCWR's Outstanding Leadership Award and one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People of 2020. Born in Brownsville, Norma grew up along the Mexican-American border. And she sometimes describes herself as a US citizen by chance. Norma began her work with refugees in the 1980s at Casa Oscar Romero. It's a shelter in San Benito, Texas, which serves Central Americans fleeing their war-torn countries. It was there that she developed a passion for her ministry with people on the move and a commitment to help all of us see and honor the human dignity of every person. And our second panelist is Melanie Thompson. Melanie is a youth outreach coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and is also a speaker, activist, and leader in the global fight to end prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation. Trafficked and sold into prostitution in New York at the age of 12, she was later arrested and placed in foster care. She's been an activist since the age of 14. Melanie's testified before numerous legislative bodies about the need to pass strong anti-trafficking laws and to end the arrest of trafficked children and adults in the sex trade. She's currently a student at the City University of New York and plans to found a nonprofit organization to assist victims of trafficking and foster care. Melanie was a vocal advocate for the FOSTA law spearheaded by our honorary co-chair Ann Wagner, which gives federal, state, and local prosecutors the tools they need to take down websites selling children. So I want to thank you for making time to be with us today. And once again, I want to welcome back Sister Winifred to moderate our exploration of the root causes of sex trafficking. And I remind each of you that you are most welcome to add your questions for the panelists to the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Winifred?
Thank you very much, Anne. And while I have read much about Norma, it is my pleasure to meet her and facilitate this moment when she presents around her vast experience. And indeed, she is a courageous woman of mercy. So Norma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, ladies. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you and to speak to you the reality that I see here at the border every day. And it's a very heartbreaking encountering hundreds and hundreds of families, women with children, women who have been through so much mothers that struggle to flee a reality they face back home, and that journey through countries and encounter one obstacle after an obstacle of abuse and disrespect to human life, where they continue to find that resilience to move forward and find themselves here at the border and then to facing more problems and more abuse and more mistreatment by everyone that can have a chance to take an opportunity at them and hurt it and taking whatever dignity they may have left. And so it is for me a privilege to accompany them and to be by their side and to try to give them back that dignity they have been taken away from, and by simply recognizing the fact that they're children of God, that they are loved because my presence among them, it shows them that I, a woman of faith, a woman of God, choose to be by their side because they're loved by Him. Who every morning when I wake up in the morning, I very clearly know this is where He wants me to be, with them, to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that they're people, they're human beings, they're women that need to be recognized and honored and respected and be given a chance in life. And so what I see every day is mothers who have shared their stories with me about how difficult it has been and how abusive our system, our society has been towards them and in every way possible. And so right now I have mixed feelings of what is presently happening at the border, because as you may all know, things have changed with this new administration. And so we had accompanied so many families that were at the refugee camp in Matamoros, and all of a sudden that has changed. This past week has been incredible of emotions of joy and tears and unbelief that the whole refugee camp that was there for almost 2 years, families struggling day after day with horrible conditions, is no longer there. Everyone has been allowed to enter the United States. It is something that I find it so amazing. The presence of God has touched that camp and has allowed them to walk through the bridge with dignity and with respect. This country has actually opened their arms and said, welcome. And they're here in the United States. We cried, one family after seeing the fact. Now, after so many of them trying to cross through the river, many of them dying, many of them abused, raped, many of them not making it through, many of them crossing and sent back time after time, now walk through the points of entry, and the officers welcome them and saying, come on in a very respectful and dignified way. It was amazing. And I think that many still are present in Mexico, many of them still waiting for that moment. At least the ones at the camp are now here in the US with their families, with moms and dads and maybe children they have never saw for maybe over a year or 2 years or more. Now they are with their families, celebrating lives, celebrating family. And so I just hope never again should we allow something like that to happen. I think that it is our responsibility to make sure we hold all of us accountable for what happens, so that we can make sure that people are not trafficked, young women are not used for things that are not right, whether it's sex or labor or anything, that we give every human person the opportunity in life that they rightfully deserve, and it's theirs and it's ours, all of us. We have the responsibility as people of God to hold each other of us accountable for doing what needs to happen to make sure we stop the abuse, we stop a society that destroys life, that hurts people. It is our responsibility. And we start by accompanying them, by being part of their journey, and by then offering how we can correct this to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norma, for your very moving sharing with us regarding the situation at the border. And I'm very struck by the contrast that you presented to us between the previous administration and the current administration, and how when the leadership of a country is what I say, having integrity and respect for people, well, that comes down even to the border controls and migration officers, etc., etc. So I think you illustrated that very powerfully. And thank you for your work and your service, and indeed for being a woman of faith, as you said, who is willing to accompany in such horrendous situations. But by your very presence, you are offering life and hope to these people who are coming. And of course, you mentioned a word that I don't think I heard this morning, and that's the resilience that is there in terms of people taking up the challenges, addressing the issues that are there, and forging ahead, wanting, desiring, longing for the fullness of life. So thank you for your witness, and thank you for sharing with us. I think Melanie has not come online, so I will pass back to Anne, and maybe we will have some questions.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, Melanie must be having some technical difficulties, but that gives us a little more time to have a conversation with Norma. So it's a blessing. And if Melanie can join us, we'll certainly welcome her when she does. So we have a few questions. I'd invite others to add their questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But we can start with this one, if you don't mind, Norma. You know, people whose migratory status is questionable, or those who find themselves in the United States without papers, or even those who are here legally, are often hesitant to report abuse that they suffer at the hands of their employers, or abuse that they suffer at the hands of others, whether they've been trafficked for sex or for labor. How can we help particularly our immigrant brothers and sisters who are understandably leery of law enforcement to report the crimes that they've been victimized by?
Yes, you know, and I think that one of the things that's important is to guarantee their safety. I think if we want them to open up and share and report, we must also help them believe and trust that by doing so, they will be safe. I think one of the reasons why they hold back from coming forward is because they're afraid that this will continue. And so therefore they don't want to name or state anybody that has abused them, or can then turn around and hurt not only them, but their families back home. And so therefore they're very careful about what they say. And so not until you actually, one of the things that I was able to accomplish it's because I became part in that journey for them while they waited and saw them in a regular, almost every day, that I became one with them as far as they knew who I was. I was uno más, un vecino más. And so they start to open up and start to share their realities and the facts of what's happening and who's doing what. And so I think trust is key in the process of opening up and sharing and naming their abusers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That makes sense. And of course, building a relationship with our neighbors is how we build that trust.
Yes.
Really, as you have done, encountering our friends and neighbors who find themselves victimized by a migration system that is desperately broken, if not totally unjust, is a way where we can begin. We've got a question about the current administration. I mean, things do seem to have turned a corner, particularly for our immigrant brothers and sisters. And to hear that the camp in Matamoros is no longer necessary is such good news. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I know how often you were there and how much the people of the camp came to depend upon you and what kind of hope you were able to bring them. So maybe we've shined a bit of a light on conditions at our southern border, and maybe there is certainly reason for hope. And we know that it's not just the previous administration that has exploited racism in order to keep migrants from entering our country. And we know that it's not just Republican administrations that have supported policies that really harm the dignity and the lives of folks desperate for safety for their families. Yeah. Would you want to just kind of maybe suggest how you think we might hold the Biden administration accountable for the promises that it's made, and what we as advocates and as allies of folks who are victims of human trafficking might best participate in what we hope will be a transformation of our immigration system, so that
yes, I think that it's not an easy task it's a very comprehensive and difficult, as we see a great numbers of people migrating to the United States and wanting to enter, and so it can become overwhelming. And so to be able to establish a process that is good and respectful to life, and that is also controlled in a safe and orderly way, it is not going to be easy. It needs the collaboration of everybody so that it can happen, because it's not an easy thing. I'm here and I'm seeing how numbers are increasing tremendously in this couple of weeks, and people crossing between points of entry and not being able, and the government trying to send back and hold them back so they can enter through a legal process, a process that is orderly and safe and correct. And at the same time, they're entering through the points of entry through the river in great numbers, and then allowing them to stay in the United States because they're not able to send them back because of some new regulations that Mexico has. And so it's going to bring in a strong burden over this new administration in trying to establish something that is good and that it doesn't get out of hand. And so I think that the new administration is going to need a lot of help in figuring out what is the best way to do it in handling this massive migration of people thinking, oh, now I have a chance. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to try to just get in just like they did in the past in previous occurrence, where anything that happens in the United States and in administrations, they use that as a means to just migrate, and it's abused by traffickers and used because it's all a money-making kind of deal for them. And so they'll use whatever to try to make their money, and therefore encourage people just to come, whether they have a reason to come or not. And so I think that is not an easy solution, but we must find ways to make it work. And part of the the solution is what I think the administration is trying to do, is also to focus on the root causes. What is making people migrate in the first place, and address the problem there, so that we can have less people migrating to the United States. And so I think that it's very comprehensive, and the only way we can arrive at it is just joining in those efforts in finding those solutions, and because otherwise it's not going to work.
Yeah, I heard Congressman Mcgovern address many of those root causes, particularly in Central America, the endemic corruption, the poverty that's pervasive, the violence that's totally out of control. All of that is some of that is of our making, and all of it should concern us, because those are the push factors, as you described, that cause folks to have to flee their homes in order to protect their families. So let's turn our attention back to the border a little bit. We've got a number of questions from folks who I think remember, was it about 3 years ago, when the needs at the border all along that southwestern border were so extreme that respite centers like your own in McAllen really needed help. Do you anticipate needing that same kind of help, whether it's in the form of contributions or supplies or volunteers? Do you anticipate, now that Remain in Mexico?
All of the above is already needed, because right now we are seeing in our respite center numbers increasing up to 500 a day, every single day, drops off. I started at 5:30 getting a call from Border Patrol saying, sister, will you authorize for us to drop off 100 people that are going to be at 5:30 in the morning, and then another one at 6:30 in the morning, and then again at 11, and so forth. And so it's like, it's so many people. And we're having to try to help them immediately, getting the right food that we need them, making sure we have the food bags that we give them for the travel, because they don't have any money to travel. So we usually do some snacks and having cheese sandwiches with water, prepare those. And then all the different needs that they have. Somebody needs milk, somebody needs water, somebody needs Pampers. There are a million things that they're all needing. And we have our respite center. Thank God it's quite large that we can hold a lot of people, but right now it's so many people. Our respite center is maybe 600 people just every single day. And so there's so many needs. And then the added problem, the added situation we have is COVID. We're making sure that everybody that's being dropped off gets tested from COVID, because we don't want them to enter a plane or a bus or even the respite center without first testing them whether they have COVID, to make sure we are all safe. But then those that test positive, which is not a very large number, but every 100 will have 1 or 2 families. And so we have to put them in a hotel to filter them and keep them there safe. But we need to pay that hotel. We need to feed them every day and keep them there until they test negative. So that is adding up. And so that's an added task that we have. And we don't have that many volunteers because of COVID. Not very many people are coming to help us out. So therefore, yes, to your all the things that you mentioned, we need your help.
So my friend, if our friends, and we are still about 260 people on this webinar, if folks are interested in making a contribution, can they find you by Googling Catholic Charities?
Yes, they can do Catholic Charities, RGV.org. That's our website that you can find us there, Catholic Charities, RGV.org.
Catholic Charities,
RGV.org. Rio Grande Valley, it's the initial.
Okay.
And then you can also find us through our, that would be the best place that you can find us, Catholic Charities, RGV.org, and contact us, and then find out how you can help us out, volunteering, sending donations. You're welcome to find any way you can.
And I might just not to create some competition here, but I'm sure there are going to be other centers along.
Yes, that's definitely all throughout the border. There are different centers like ours doing their best to respond like we are as well. So any center, any response support any of us.
Norma, for those folks who are less familiar about what the journey is going to be for our brothers and sisters, could you just kind of say, okay, so they've been permitted to enter the United States, which already makes them less likely to be victimized by human traffickers on the Mexican side of the border.
Yes.
Then what's the journey? Where do they go? How do they get there?
Yes, once they enter the United States, the Border Patrol will process them, and in some cases right now are releasing them, because they're releasing only those families that have tender age children, as they name, children that have less than 7 years old, because Mexico is not allowing them to be returned to Mexico. Everybody else is returned to Mexico, because basically they want them to go through a legal process through the point of entry instead of entering through the river. However, because Mexico does not allow them to return children under the age of 7, then the Border Patrol is forced to release them into the United States. This is the families that we're receiving right now. These families then are in contact with their family members, and they travel to those points of where they are. And they will continue that process at that point by going to a immigration office and continuing that legal process. There are some plans in establishing some case management programs that USCCB and Catholic Church USA is beginning to work together in establishing, so that every family that travels beyond this point to their points of destination find a case manager that will accompany them and make sure they show up to court. They make sure they have the services available that they need at those points where they're ending up. And so that is in motion to happen. And so I think the hope is that those families that are already in the United States will be able to get the assistance and the guidance they need to determine whether they have a legitimate case, fear for their lives, and they can proceed to follow up with that process. And so that is what's happening at the present time.
Thank you. Thank you. So the point is, everybody has to enter through the part
through a bridge, which is referred to as point of entry, and not through a river.
Yeah.
It's the best, but many of them are entering through the river because they're finding that this is their opportunity and this can get in. So that's why they're doing that, you know. And so for now, we're seeing a lot of people because they're entering through the river, you know. And so this is where we're getting the high numbers of people coming to the United States.
And would I be correct in assuming that most folks will have a family in the United States or
Yes.
friends who will be their sponsors once they've gone through the initial screening at the border?
That's a good point you're making. I would say that my greater majority of them have somebody in the United States. They have a family, mother, friend, or someone they know where they're going to. There are those exceptions, and there's where we have to find a sponsor for them, a community that says, we will take that person. If you have a family or an individual that's in the United States and does not have an address, does not have a place where they can go to, and that community can sponsor them and be able to give them a place where they can live and then show up to court and follow up with them as they are here in the United States. I would definitely welcome anyone that says, sign me up. I would like to be considered, or my community would like to be considered to sponsor a family or two. And that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. If there are any other questions, there are a few. I just need to look. To what extent do you think human traffickers are using children to accompany older adults when they enter the United States?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think previously, before MPP, we started to notice that was happening to some extent. The greater majority of them were children with their parents, but there were times that Border Patrol was able to identify somebody that was not the parent, and they utilized the consulados of their countries to verify whether that person, that child, and that parent was the actual parent of that child, and because they were seeing that was happening. And so I wouldn't be surprised that may start to happen again as well. And so trafficking of child is definitely something to be cautious about. And I always keep an eye. If a parent at our respite center is very negligent and not attentive to their child, I always raise a red flag and says maybe this parent is not really the parent of this child. And I will call the consulado and tell them, can you follow up on this parent? Because it gives me signs that maybe he may not be or she may not be the parent.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know. So there's lots of thanks in my question and answer box. Thanks to Norma for sharing what you know with us today, but more than that, for the work that you do, for the example that you are, for all that you are and do. Lots of thanks coming through in the Q&A. So I think if I'm watching the right boxes, I think we of Melanie that we could share at this point. We've not been able to make the connection with her live, but we do have a video that we could share. So if we can do that, and I'm looking at my tech folk to see a few minutes we have for this section and see if we can put Melanie on.
When I was in street prostitution, when I was on Backpage, it was dangerous, and when I was in underground strip clubs, it was dangerous. So I don't think there's one any more harmful than the other. I was kidnapped at the age of 12, and I was brought into the sex trade, locked in an abandoned house behind a closet, and forced to do everything from street prostitution to underground strip clubbing, and then eventually the internet, which is kind of why I'm here today. I had an exploiter, I had a trafficker who would do the ads for me, would write the ads and or stay right next to me and have me write the ads and would tell me all the things to say and what to write and things of that nature. For years, maybe up until this point, I struggled with feeling like I was less than, dehumanized. I always lived in this constant victim state and state of paranoia and state of feeling like I didn't amount to, a lot of the people that were around me. The only difference between FOSTA SESTA is that FOSTA is federal and SESTA is state, and they both serve the same purpose. So back in 1996, there was the Communications Decency Act. In the CDA of 1996, there was this small clause that basically said that websites or internet sites are not responsible for third-party content. And now that FOSTA SESTA has passed, what it does is change that small clause in the CDA of 1996 to basically state that from that point on, from its passing, internet sites are now being held accountable for knowingly facilitating prostitution.
This basically takes away their ability to screen clients.
I just know it's a big fuck you to the sex worker community.
John's all over to me, sex buyers are dangerous, but specifically on Backpage and sites alike, they were the most violent dates, the most violent Johns. It can target somebody that is under 13 and it can target somebody that's over 50. So even just beyond a financial issue, it's a sexist issue for sure. It's gender-based violence. I've heard them say, because the sites are now shut down, they are now forced into more dangerous situations in the street. And what I want to say to that is that prostitution was dangerous on any level. And it's always been dangerous, and it will continue to be dangerous as long as it is violating somebody's human rights. It's definitely a victory on a personal level. I'm so happy that the website that exploited me for all of these years is now eradicated. But that does not mean that other websites will not turn up. That does not mean that children and adults are not still being trafficked. Pimps are very innovative, as are other traffickers and sex buyers, and they will find other ways to continue to exploit a person's body. So I honestly do believe that it's definitely something we're smiling about, but it's not the end. One of the things that I advocate for is partial decrim, or partial decriminalization of prostitution. Decriminalizing the person that's engaging in prostitution, or in their words, the sex worker, right? And criminalizing those who perpetrate it, so the sex buyers and the pimps or the traffickers. One day, instead of criminalizing those in prostitution, offer them resources and services, things like healthcare, housing. So definitely like trying to get them more jobs and get them financially stable so that so prostitution doesn't have to be an option for anybody.
Well, thank you all for making that happen. Again, we apologize for not being able to bring you Melanie in person, but I think you could tell even from this short video about what a compelling story she has and what an articulate spokesperson she is for human trafficking, those who've been victimized by human trafficking. We look for big things from Melanie Thompson in the future. So Norma, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Your expertise and your wisdom, born of commitment to the struggle for dignity for all God's children, is an inspiration to each of us. And thank you all for your patience with our technical difficulties. So at this time, it's my pleasure to share a recorded message from another of our congressional co-chairs, Congresswoman Ann Wagner of Missouri. Representative Wagner is another longtime supporter of this conference and an ally in our efforts to end human trafficking. So I give you Congresswoman Wagner.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Ann Wagner from the 2nd District of Missouri. Although I wish I could be meeting with you all in person, I am glad we can come together virtually to discuss our shared fight to end the modern slave trade. We have made tremendous progress in recent years. In getting my legislation, the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA, signed into law in 2018 was a monumental task and has had a profound impact on the online sex trade. But as the only lawmaker to ever amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, I know we have a difficult fight ahead. The pandemic is exacerbating trafficking and sexual and domestic violence, and I'm gravely concerned that women and children are increasingly vulnerable to exploitation. With our kids isolated and online, predators have ramped up their grooming activities. Last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found that reports of online enticement skyrocketed by 98%. Congress must ensure that tech companies and social media websites take action to stop this from happening. Last Congress, I introduced the Earn It Act, a bipartisan bicameral bill that will bring together survivors, law enforcement, privacy advocates, and computer science experts to establish best practices to prevent and respond to online child exploitation. Additionally, the bill would hold tech companies accountable for the promotion, presentation, or distribution of child sexual abuse material. So many children are in frightening and vulnerable situations right now, and I'm committed to working with my colleagues to end the horrors of online child sexual abuse. Our work to eliminate human trafficking does not end at our borders, and building the capacity of partner nations to prevent violence against women and children strengthens justice systems and ensures the safety of their citizens is essential to putting traffickers out of business. Through my work as the vice-ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I've been proud to advance legislation to address the root causes of trafficking. I'm looking forward to resuming work on my Central American Women and Children Protection Act, which passed the House twice last Congress. In 2019, I traveled to Guatemala to meet women and girls who courageously shared stories of the violence they faced in their communities and at home. Tragically, Central America struggles to control high rates of femicide and child homicide, and regional governments allow impunity for perpetrators of violence. The women and the girls that I met are determined, resourceful, and filled with hope. They do not want to leave their homes to make a harrowing journey to the United States, during which they are actually vulnerable to traffickers and other dangers. But they need security and safety to grow strong families and lift their communities out of poverty. That's why Representative Norma Torres of California and I introduced the Central American Women and Children Protection Act. This bipartisan legislation authorizes the United States to enter into bilateral agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to create safer communities for women and children. Under these compacts, the United States will be a key partner in promoting regional security and eliminating the factors that force women and children to leave their homelands. I thank you. I thank you for your strong support, and I hope you will again join me in promoting this important bill so we can send it to the President's desk. Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to you for all that you do, and I look forward to working with you as we continue our fight to end human trafficking in all its forms. Thank you.
Oh, many thanks to Congresswoman Wagner. We're most grateful for her commitment, for her leadership on legislation, and for once again serving as an honorary co-chair of this conference. So now it seems particularly fitting that we turn our attention to legislative remedies to the scourge of human trafficking. And once again, I remind you that we will have time for a few questions. And by now, I know you know the drill. Please write your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So here to help us look at that national legislation that Congresswoman Wagner was just referencing is my friend and my colleague, Scott Wright. Scott is the director of the Columban Center for Advocacy and Outreach, the Justice and Peace and Ecology Office of the U.S. region of the Missionary Society of St. Columban. The congregation is actively involved with migrants and asylum seekers on the U.S.-Mexico border, with the Columban Mission Center in El Paso, Texas, and a parish in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. So Scott, I'm hoping that you can kind of fill in the gaps, crack open this piece of legislation, the Central American Women and Children Protection Act, and give us some ideas about how we might engage in some advocacy that will help to address the root causes of human trafficking. So Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. We would again like to thank our panelists and survivors who offered testimony today, and to the congresspersons who offered messages of support. Now we turn to the part where each of you participating on this webinar play a crucial part. We know there is a direct link between forced migration and human trafficking. Once migrants are forced to leave their homes and migrate, and this is especially true for women and children, they are particularly vulnerable to human traffickers to cross borders at every step along the way of their journey, and as they wait on the Mexico side of the US border to cross. To make that very point, I'd like to share this brief quote from Pope Francis. He says, "No one should be obliged to flee their country, but the wrong is doubled when the migrant is forced into the hands of people traffickers in order to cross borders, and tripled when they reach the land they thought would give them a better future, only to find themselves despised, exploited, abandoned, or enslaved. We need to welcome, promote, protect, and integrate those who come in search of better lives for themselves and their families." So what can we do? Today and tomorrow, we would invite you to contact your congressional representative and your senators to support a specific piece of legislation. As the Congresswoman mentioned, it's called the Central American Women and Children's Protection Act. Essentially, it addresses the root causes of migration so that women and children in particular are not forced to migrate and become extremely vulnerable to human traffickers. The legislation authorizes the State Department to provide assistance to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras through bilateral agreements to increase the protection of women and children in their homes and communities, reduce female homicides, domestic violence, and sexual assault. It's important that you know that this bill specifically prohibits any funds going to these Central American governments. Instead, the funds must be channeled through civil society. When you do engage with your congressional representative and senators by email, be sure to make the link between the root causes and the migration situation at the border. That means the more we can do to address root causes, which this bill does, the more likely people will not be forced to migrate and remain in their homes and be able to remain in their homes. This bill has strong support on both sides of the aisle and in both the House and the Senate. Last year, the Senate bill had 24 co-sponsors, almost half the Senate. We are asking our senators and representatives to support both bills and to co-sponsor them. To make things simple, check the chat box. We're dropping the link to the National Advocacy Center's Action Alert. Then using this Action Alert link, you will be able to easily and quickly email your senators and representatives. Everything already is filled out, or you may edit it to make changes and write your own email. Go ahead, copy the link in the chat or click on the link to open a new window. But don't respond just yet. We have a few more minutes to go. We also will email the action alert to you this afternoon. Tomorrow, we will share about an opportunity to call our representatives and senators about the bill, providing the script with talking points, and to take part in a Twitter storm. While this bill is our only official federal legislation we are currently supporting, the congressional session is still young, and we expect there will be more legislative opportunities. The National Advocacy Center will follow up with everyone as additional legislation is supported. Thank you so much for participating in this crucial endeavor.
Scott, thank you. Thank you for the advocacy that you do each and every day here in Washington. And thank you for helping us become a little more aware about what we can do, how each of us can play a role in ensuring that we have legislative solutions that actually attack the root causes of human trafficking. So let me see if we have any questions for you before I let you go. I've got one so far. So I'm wondering, Scott, if you could say something more about other potential pieces of legislation or other legislative ideas about how we can use US government policy to really attack the root causes of human trafficking. Now, that's kind of if you were a legislator, what else do you think needs to be done?
Well, you know, I think all throughout this session together, Sister Winifred and others have pointed out how that everything's interconnected. Human trafficking, labor and sex trafficking, slavery, as I think is the ideal word to characterize what this is. It's all connected to root causes. It's all connected to the situation on the border. It's all connected to US policy regarding global economic issues. So what I would say, without any specific legislative opportunities at the current moment, other than this one, is be attentive to what those opportunities are. And the National Advocacy Center, those of us present here will help you and remind you and invite you to advocate when those opportunities arise. But also be attentive to the root causes, because unless we really address those root causes, and that's a long-term endeavor, a long-term struggle, but a necessary one, these problems will continue. Human trafficking will continue, human slavery will continue. So be attentive to the long-term solutions, be attentive to the opportunities. And I especially want to lift up on this International Women's Day, Sister Norma mentioned, Sister Winifred and others, the really protagonistic role that survivors play, particularly women. The resilience, I think that's an amazing testimony of courage, and we need to support them in every way we can with the same courage and the same passion for justice.
Well, thank you so much for that. Truly, it's a little serendipitous. I don't think we originally planned to have the conference coincide with International Women's Day, but what a very special day to be able to raise up women of courage, women of resilience, as you say, Scott. So thanks for that reminder. Can you do one more question for me? I'd say he can. So yes. Here goes. Scott, as a person of faith, what inspires you to do this kind of advocacy?
I'll speak very personally. I was thinking when Sister Norma shared, in the 1980s, working with Central American refugees and migrants and Mexican migrants and refugees. I also, during the 1980s, was working in refugee camps on the U.S. In the Honduran El Salvadoran border, and then with displaced communities in El Salvador. And I think, shining the light, the theme of our Congress, shining on the light on the root causes, the gender-based violence, the impact of policies from the US, both military and economic, that are impact people in their day-to-day lives, but also shining on the light on the resilience, the goodness, the courage of people impacted, and particularly women and children. It's an invitation. The migrants, the survivors have a claim on our lives, and we have the opportunity, we have the privilege to be able to do everything we can to influence that US legislation, US policy. So it's really the encounter with those migrants, those survivors, that made, in my life, all the difference.
Thank you. Winifred, would you like to jump in on that question as well? What, as a woman of faith, who's given her life over to be of service to God's people and God's creation, what is it in your faith that inspires you to do the kind of advocacy that you do at the United Nations in New York?
Oh, that's a big question, Anne. I presume all of my life has been shaped and formed by the charism of Good Shepherd sisters and the reaching out that one person is of more value than the world. And I kind of don't like to use than the world, because now in our new consciousness, the person and the world, the planet, need and deserve our attention and our respect and mutuality, both with the planet and among ourselves. So I think that's where I maybe began to understand what was happening. Of course, the gospel call, where we have in St. John's Gospel, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I think that in many senses sums up for me why I engage in this particular mission at the United Nations. And I came here from a lot of experience with regard to interacting personally and professionally with people who have been exploited in Ireland, in Africa. And so I had I saw the pain of the people. So coming here in terms of advocacy at the United Nations really takes one to an alternative universe. That's the way I think I experienced it when I arrived here over 14 years ago. But being here and seeing the evolution that has happened in terms of policy, the policies that are framed at the United Nations, trying to bring all member states together around the gender inequality issue, around the climate change, around migration. And when Norma was speaking, I was thinking of being privileged to have walked with the United Nations in terms of the development of the New York Declaration on migrants and refugees, and then later to the Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. And indeed, the whole development of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals from social to planet to economic. So I find that those calls are marvelous moments when in actual fact the struggle to live the gospel is worked out in the United Nations. Now we're at a very particular difficult moment in the United Nations and multilateralism. So the resistance to addressing the systemic issues, as I put them out there, in terms of commercialization, digitalization, calling people to account. People, individual member states are very slow to take those policies up. And I have spent, I think, all of my time here on social protection floors, which to me is the answer, the natural answer to everything we have said here today in terms of enabling people, whether we're talking about a minimum floor or whether we're talking about basic income, because I've heard that come up here in some of the discussion prior to the election, etc. But empowering people to be able to take control of their own lives. And it means changing an attitude. And I'll stop now when I say this. It means changing one's attitude from thinking that people are users and take things for nothing, while the other side, the corporate sector, can have money and accumulate it without any concern for the sharing. And as I quoted Mahatma Gandhi, there's enough resources in the planet for everybody's need, but not for everyone's greed. And if you see the amount of money that was made by a few billionaires during the COVID times, and the struggle to get the stimulus package for the peoples of America, this is the real tension point. And I again urge, I commend the work that you do at the Advocacy Centre in terms of following up with Congress, but we also need, I think, to become more vocal around the global structures and how they are the carriers of the injustice that so many people experience in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Scott. It clearly, this is personal for you. This is something that springs from deep within. And for that, we're grateful. The challenges that are before us are huge, and so are the opportunities. So thank you two and each of our panelists today for reminding us of the strength that we share, of the opportunities that are in fact ours. Ending human trafficking can happen in my lifetime. We have what it takes. It's simply a matter of political will. Are we willing to do the hard work that will ensure that all people everywhere can live in dignity and freedom that is theirs simply because they are children of God? So thank you all. So we come to the end of day one of our conference. Thank you for joining us today. Special thanks to our presenters for helping to shine that light on the root causes and the various intersections of human trafficking. Tomorrow, we will continue with a look at more ways that we can strengthen our efforts to end human trafficking by addressing its root causes. We'll hear from Jennifer Reyes-Lay, the Executive Director of U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, from Hillary Chester, who is the Associate Director for Anti-Trafficking Service at USCCB, Kara Griffin, a member of the Charlotte Catholic Charities Anti-Trafficking Task Force, and from Gail Luanga Crumbly, a Sister of the Good Shepherd and a member of the National Black Sisters Conference. We'll look a little harder, a little more deeply at what we can do, each of us as individuals and all of us together. So thank you again for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today. We will see you back here tomorrow at 12 o'clock Eastern Time for our call to action to end human trafficking. You can join us tomorrow using the same link that you used today, but not to worry. Our friends who've produced this great show will be sending you an email tomorrow morning with the link. Please join us. Thank you very much and have a very blessed rest of your day.